Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and it's 1923 in Weimar, Germany. At least it is in this presentation. It's the year in which the Ruhr was occupied by French and Belgian troops. It's the year of hyperinflation, and it's the year of the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. A quiet year then. Now, in looking at 1923, you can of course face a question that simply asks you what it was all about, like those you see on the slide. And in answering it, you can include anything, from the causes, to the invasion itself, to passive resistance, to the consequences. You are using your knowledge. And when it comes to the causes, there's plenty that can be included, and I'm going to leave out a lot of the detail. In 1922, the German government claimed it couldn't afford to make its second reparations payment. But the French, who had their own war debts to pay and who had suffered at the hands of the German invasion, were not in the mood for concessions. So, with the payment deadline having passed, in January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's main industrial region, in order to take what was owed them in raw materials and goods. They took over coal mines, steelworks, factories, and the railways, as they could under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And that's just the causes, and covers some kinds of B questions you might face, like the one on the slide. A paragraph on the issue of reparations, why they were imposed, and maybe the amount and the pressure on France that had those debts to America to pay, and a paragraph on why the Ruhr region was chosen, why it was so important. That will cover that kind of B question. You're applying the same kind of knowledge as you might for a question A, but you're doing it differently. As long as you do it appropriately, you can't go wrong. Or you might get a question that focuses on what happened as a result of the occupation, like the A question you see on this slide. And in answering, you can include general comments, like inflation spiraled out of control, or money became worthless. Or you could focus on different groups, for example, the middle class or the elderly. And hyperinflation leads us to German reactions to 1923 and potential B questions, such as the one I've also included on this slide. Now for me, I would devote a paragraph on the humiliation Germans experienced, and then a paragraph on the economic impact, hyperinflation. First, the humiliation. The German government couldn't respond militarily. The Treaty of Versailles had forced Germany to reduce the size of its army to just 100,000 men, and it would have been quickly crushed. So Germany couldn't protect its own people. And so the government called for passive resistance. This meant that government officials and workers in the Ruhr region refused to cooperate. For example, postal workers and telephone and telegraph workers refused to assist the occupying forces. Railway workers refused to run trains, and workers in the mines, steelworks and factories went on strike. In this way, the Germans hoped that the French would have nothing to take. But this brought a harsh response from the French and Belgian troops. They arrested and imprisoned those officials and workers who refused to cooperate, and they expelled somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 people from their homes, driving them out of the region. In the protests, over 100 people were killed. And I would then turn to the economic effects. The workers needed to be paid in order to live, and those who had been forced out of the region needed government help too. This was all paid by the government, who were already burdened with war pensions and the general struggle to recover from the war. And at a time when passive resistance meant workers weren't working, companies weren't operating, and so tax revenues were down. In a nutshell, the government was spending much more money and earning much less. And so it responded by simply printing more money. Now, what happens when there is too much money in circulation is that prices in the shops go up and up. But this in turn forces wages to be increased, which pushes prices even higher in a terrible upward spiral of inflation, and so forces the government to print yet more money until things get totally out of control. In fact, so bad was the situation in Germany in 1923 that we refer to what happened as hyperinflation. You will know all the crazy stories about hyperinflation, so I'm not going to get into that. But the bottom line, and the most important, is that money became worthless and people suffered. There were those who were okay, some even benefiting, and you will know about them. But the vast majority of people suffered as a consequence, and two groups in particular. Those with pensions, which just couldn't keep up with the price rises, and those with savings, which became worthless. So the elderly and the middle class. And this leads us to other potential B questions about the significance of 1923. And again, I've included a couple on the slide for you. Now, I've already explained the immediate importance, the economic price and the humiliation, and we could add Hitler's putsch, which I'll cover in another presentation. And even when a new government headed by a new Chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, ended the policy of passive resistance and got Germans back to work, he gained no credit from the right-wing nationalists. They accused him of not only accepting the hated Treaty of Versailles, but of forcing Germany to once more back down. But there was a long-term importance to 1923 too. Weimar may have recovered for a time, but the German people didn't forget. They didn't forget the hyperinflation, and they didn't forget the humiliation. And when the Great Depression struck, they thought, here we go again. And they'd had enough. And in increasing numbers, they turned to extremist parties. But there are very general questions about how we should assess the Weimar Republic to consider too. And I think 1923 can be a focus of a paragraph in answering any of these questions. Why? Because the Weimar Republic had been unable to prevent the French-Belgian occupation. Because the passive resistance it ordered was a mistake, bringing not only further humiliation, but hyperinflation and economic ruin, and because it resulted in further political chaos, the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. And by the way, I put a cartoon about reparations on this slide, as I think that this was one of the key issues to dominate Weimar, and was the key issue behind the events of 1923. So, a sketch of 1923 for you. The top marks will require the detail, illustrations or examples to support your points, to provide evidence, to back up your points. But I think I've provided you with the approaches you should make and with a sense of that detail you would need. And besides, if you don't think you have enough detail in your notes, you know where you can find my detail in my ebooks on Amazon. But for now, my only remaining job is to thank you for listening and wish you luck in your studies. Cheers.